The hand hit my shoulder before I even heard him move. I stumbled sideways into the corridor wall, my books sliding out of my arms and scattering across the polished floor. For a moment, everything went quiet, except the ringing in my ear and the soft hum of the Academy's overhead lights. "Watch where you are standing, Deathworlder," Kalendor said, stepping past me like I was furniture that had been placed in his way. I did not fall. I did not cry out. I simply straightened my back, picked up my books one by one, and said nothing. That was the hardest part. Not the shove itself, the silence I forced myself to keep afterward. My name is Mira Voss, and I am, as far as anyone in this academy is concerned, a walking rumor. I come from a planet called Caldrus, a place most species in this galaxy describe using words like brutal, merciless, and unsurvivable. They call it a death world. I call it home. I am one of only 3 humans who have ever been accepted into the Interstellar Officers Academy, and the only one currently enrolled. I did not get here through charity or quota. I earned my seat through testing scores that made 3 separate admissions committees request a second review, certain that a scoring error had occurred. There was no error. I was simply better prepared than they expected, because where I come from, being unprepared means you do not get a second chance. Kalendor does not care about any of that. He comes from Aurelia Prime, a garden world so gentle that its people do not even have a word for famine. His family holds political influence that stretches across 3 star systems, and he has spent his entire life being told that he is destined for greatness. When I outscored him in the simulator rankings during our second week of training, something in him decided that could not be allowed to stand. I gathered the last of my books from the floor and walked to my quarters without looking back at him. My shoulder throbbed where his hand had struck me, already forming a bruise beneath my uniform sleeve. It was not a serious injury. On my homeworld, children learn to walk through terrain that would kill an adult from almost any other species within a day. A shove in a hallway barely registers as discomfort. But it was not about the pain. It was about what the pain represented. I sat on the edge of my bed that night, staring at the star chart on my wall, tracing the tiny dot that marked Caldrus among 1,000 other worlds. I thought about my mother, who had taught me to recognize the warning calls of predators before I could properly speak. I thought about my father, who had shown me how to purify water from streams that would poison almost any other species within minutes. I thought about the friends I had lost growing up, not to violence, but simply to the ordinary business of surviving somewhere that did not want us there. Humans are strange to the rest of the galaxy. We evolved on a world with punishing gravity, unpredictable weather, aggressive wildlife, and diseases that mutate faster than most species can study them. To survive there, our bodies developed in ways that other species find deeply unsettling. Our reflexes are faster than they should be for a species of our size. Our bones are denser. Our muscles generate more force per movement than physics seems to allow for creatures our shape. Scientists from a dozen other worlds have written papers trying to explain it, and most of them end with some version of the same conclusion. Humans should not be able to do what they do, and yet they do it anyway. None of this makes us proud. If anything, it makes many of us cautious. We know what our bodies are capable of, and most of us spend our whole lives making sure we never have to find out in front of someone else. I had promised myself, on the shuttle ride to this academy, that I would not be the human who confirmed every frightened rumor. I wanted to be known for my mind, my discipline, my scores, not for what my hands could do if I ever stopped holding them back. The academy itself is beautiful in a way that still surprises me some mornings. Built into the side of a mountain on a temperate, orderly world, its towers catch the light of 2 suns at once, and the training halls stretch wide enough to hold entire simulated battlefields. Cadets from a dozen species walk its halls, most of them soft in ways they do not even realize, raised on worlds that never demanded very much of their bodies. They are kind in their own way. They are also, without meaning to be, careless. Careless is a good word for what happened in that corridor. Kalen did not think of it as anything serious. To him, it was a small, satisfying correction, a way of reminding the girl from the primitive world that she did not belong at the top of the rankings. He did not consider, even for a moment, what it might mean to put his hand on someone built the way I was built. I decided, that first night, that I would not give him the reaction he wanted. I would report it through proper channels, the way the Academy's own conduct guide instructed. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that a formal system built by careful, rule-following species would take a complaint seriously, regardless of how small the injury looked on a medical scan. The next morning, I walked to the administration office before my first class, my report already drafted on my data slate. The officer at the desk, a tall, feathered being named Rel, looked over my complaint with polite disinterest. "A shove," Rel said, glancing at the description. "Any visible injury?" I rolled up my sleeve. The bruise had darkened overnight, spreading across my shoulder in shades of deep blue and violet. Rel's feathers flattened slightly, the closest thing to surprise their species displayed. "That will be logged," Rel said, tapping something into their console. "Someone will follow up." I thanked them and left, feeling, for the first time since arriving, a small flicker of hope that the system might actually work the way it was supposed to. I did not yet understand how differently the Academy would come to see an injury on a body like mine, once it started asking questions it had never needed to ask before. Classes that day felt unusually long. In tactical theory, I sat 2 rows behind Kalen, watching the back of his neck as he laughed quietly with his friends, utterly unconcerned. In hand-to-hand fundamentals, our instructor, a broad-shouldered veteran named Officer Halden, paired us for a basic grappling drill, apparently unaware or uninterested in the tension between us. "Light contact only," Halden reminded the room. "This is about form, not force." Kalen smiled at me as we squared off on the mat, a private, knowing smile meant only for me. "Try not to hurt yourself, Deathworlder," he said, just loud enough for the cadets nearby to hear. I did not answer. I simply performed the drill exactly as instructed, controlled and precise, letting him believe, for now, that his words had landed exactly as he intended. Inside, something old and familiar stirred, something I had spent years learning to keep quiet. It was not anger exactly, it was recognition. My body remembered, in the way bodies always remember, that somewhere in this pleasant, orderly place, a threat had introduced itself to me, and every instinct shaped by a lifetime on Caldris was quietly, patiently taking note. I finished the drill without incident, bowed to Kalen the way protocol required, and walked off the mat with my heartbeat steady and my expression calm. I told myself that the formal complaint would be enough. I told myself that reasonable people, once informed, would handle this reasonably. I did not yet know how wrong I was about to be proven, or how much that mistake would end up costing everyone involved, including me. That evening, alone in my quarters, I opened a small data file I kept hidden from almost everyone at the Academy. It contained old recordings from home, footage my parents had sent before I left. In one clip, my younger cousin, barely 7 years old, calmly climbed down a cliff face to retrieve a lost tool, moving with a steadiness that would have terrified any child from a gentler world. In another, my father demonstrated how to break the grip of a predator twice his size using nothing but leverage and timing, his voice calm the entire time, as though he were teaching me to fold laundry rather than survive an attack. I watched these clips not out of nostalgia, but out of reminder. They reminded me what I came from, and what I had chosen to leave behind when I stepped onto that shuttle. I had not come to this academy to prove anything about strength. I had come to prove that a girl from a death world could sit in the same classrooms as the galaxy's privileged children and outthink them fairly, without ever needing to lay a hand on anyone. I closed the file, turned off the lights, and lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar quiet of a world with no predators outside my window, wondering how long I could keep my restraint intact in a place that seemed determined, one small provocation at a time, to test it. Somewhere on the other side of the academy, Kalen Dorr was almost certainly sleeping soundly, confident that nothing serious would come of a simple shove in an empty corridor. He had no idea what he had actually started. 3 days passed with no word about my complaint. I told myself patience was reasonable. Academies handle hundreds of small disputes every semester, and I was, after all, a new species to their system, an unfamiliar case that probably required extra review. I kept attending my classes, kept my head down during drills, and kept quietly rehearsing the same lesson my parents had taught me since childhood. Control is not weakness, it is the highest form of strength. On the 4th day, I was called into a small office near the administration wing. A mid-ranking officer named Commander Faith sat behind a data desk, scrolling through my complaint with an expression that suggested she had already reached a conclusion before I even sat down. "Cadet Voss," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I have reviewed your report regarding Cadet Dorr." "Thank you," I said, sitting carefully, my hands folded in my lap the way I had been taught to present myself in formal settings back home. "I want to be direct with you," Faith continued. "Physical contact between cadets, especially during training weeks, is extremely common. Cadets bump into each other. Tempers flare. In most cases, these incidents resolve themselves without any need for formal proceedings." He struck my shoulder deliberately, outside of any training exercise. I said, keeping my voice level. There was no accident involved. Faith glanced down at a small note on her desk. "The medical scan attached to your file shows no fracture, no internal damage, and localized bruising consistent with, and I am reading this directly, minor blunt contact. The bruising was significant," I said. "For a human, perhaps," Faith said, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Our medical staff tell me that human tissue bruises more visibly than most other species, even from very light contact. It looks worse than it is." I felt something tighten in my chest, a slow, cold recognition of what was happening. They were not disputing that Kalen had struck me. They were disputing that it mattered. "With respect," I said, "the visibility of the injury is not the issue. The intent behind the contact is." Faith folded her hands. "Cadet Dorr has stated that the contact was accidental, the result of a crowded corridor. Without additional witnesses or evidence contradicting his account, there is little more the Academy can do beyond a verbal reminder about hallway conduct." "There were no witnesses because it happened in an empty corridor," I said. "That does not mean it did not happen." "I understand your frustration," Faith said, and for a brief moment, something like genuine discomfort passed across her face. "But I have to work within the evidence available to me. I have already spoken to Cadet Dorr informally. He has been reminded to be more careful." I sat there for a long moment, absorbing the shape of what had just happened. A formal complaint, filed correctly, supported by physical evidence, had been reduced to a verbal reminder about hallway conduct. Not because anyone believed I was lying, simply because no one, including the officer sitting across from me, believed the injury was serious enough to warrant more. "Is there anything else, Cadet Voss?" Faith asked, already reaching to close my file. "No," I said quietly. "Thank you for your time." I walked out of that office with my composure fully intact, because that is what I had trained my entire life to do, hold steady no matter what the moment demanded of me. But inside, something had shifted. I understood now, in a way I had not fully understood before, that the Academy's systems had been built entirely around the assumptions of gentler worlds. A bruise on my skin, dark and obvious as it was, simply did not register the same way on their scales as it would have on almost any of theirs. For the first time since arriving, I felt truly alone. It was not that my classmates were unkind, not most of them. Many of the other cadets were curious about me in a friendly, if occasionally awkward way. A cadet named Nora Ashwell, from a moderate world with mild seasons and gentle wildlife, had become something close to a friend over the past few weeks, sharing meals with me and asking earnest questions about Caldris that came from genuine curiosity rather than mockery. I found Nora that evening in the study hall, hunched over a stack of navigation texts, and told her, in careful, measured words, what had happened in Commander Faith's office. Her expression shifted from confusion to quiet anger as I spoke. "That is completely unfair," Nora said, closing her book. "He hit you, and they are treating it like a scheduling error." "They do not understand what contact means for someone like me," I said. "To them, a bruise this size would suggest something far more severe than a simple shove. To me, it barely registers as an injury at all. I think that gap in understanding is working against me, not for me." "Then show them," Nora said. "Show them what it actually took to bruise you like that. Maybe if they understood the scale of things properly, they would take it seriously." I considered her suggestion carefully. It was tempting, in a strange way, to simply demonstrate, plainly and without exaggeration, exactly how much force a human body could absorb, and exactly how much force it took to leave a mark on one. But something in me resisted the idea immediately. "If I do that," I said slowly, "I confirm every fear they already have about humans. I do not want to be known here as the girl who proved she could withstand or deliver serious force. I want to be known as someone who earned her place through discipline." Nora studied me for a long moment. "I understand that. But Mira, discipline only protects you if the people around you respect it. Right now, it sounds like they are mistaking your restraint for weakness." Her words stayed with me long after our conversation ended. Over the following days, I noticed a subtle change in how Kalen carried himself around me. Where before there had been a private smirk, now there was something closer to open confidence. Word of the failed complaint had clearly reached him, likely through his family's connections within the administration, and he seemed to interpret the Academy's inaction as a kind of quiet permission. He began finding small ways to test that permission. A shoulder bumped a little too hard while passing in a corridor. A comment about Deathworld savages, delivered just loud enough for me to hear but just quiet enough to avoid clear documentation. A deliberate collision during a group exercise, followed by an insincere apology offered with a smile that made clear no apology was actually intended. I documented each incident carefully, exactly as Academy procedure required, even though I no longer expected any of it to matter. I told myself I was building a record, in case things escalated further, though some quiet part of me already understood that escalation was inevitable, given how little consequence Kalen had faced so far. During this period, I threw myself deeper into my studies, partly out of genuine dedication, and partly, I admit now, as a way of proving something to myself. I spent long hours in the simulator bay, running combat scenarios and strategic planning modules well past the point most other cadets would have stopped. My scores climbed steadily, and my instructors began to take notice, praising my analytical approach during tactical briefings in ways that, months earlier, would have filled me with quiet pride. Now, that praise felt hollow, overshadowed by the growing awareness that excellence alone was not going to protect me from what was clearly building towards something worse. One evening, Officer Halden, my hand-to-hand instructor, called me aside after class. He was not a cruel man, simply a practical one, focused entirely on technique and results. "Your form has improved considerably, Cadet Voss," he said, watching me collect my gear. "You move with more restraint than most cadets your age. Careful control, minimal wasted force." "Thank you, sir," I said. He studied me for a moment longer than felt comfortable. "There is a difference, cadet, between controlling your strength and hiding it. I have trained enough cadets to recognize both. You are doing the second one." I did not answer immediately, unsure how much honesty the moment allowed for. "I am simply following proper drill techniques, sir," I said carefully. Halden's expression suggested he did not entirely believe me, though he did not press the point further. "Just be careful," he said instead, gathering his own equipment. "Control that goes unacknowledged for too long has a tendency to surface eventually, whether we intend it to or not." I thought about his words for the rest of that night, turning them over slowly in my mind. I did not yet know how quickly they would prove true. The following week brought a mandatory joint training exercise between several cadet squads designed to simulate coordinated combat scenarios under pressure. Cadets from multiple worlds would be paired randomly, tested not only on individual skill but on their ability to react honestly under stress, without time to plan or posture beforehand. When the pairing list was posted outside the main training hall, I felt a small, cold knot form in my stomach as I read the names assigned to my group. Kalen Dorr's name sat directly beside mine. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the list, aware that whatever fragile balance I had maintained over the past 2 weeks was about to be tested in front of an audience far larger than any empty corridor could provide. Nora found me a few minutes later, reading over my shoulder, and went very quiet. "Mira," she said softly, "whatever happens tomorrow, please be careful." I did not answer right away. I simply looked at the training schedule, at the countdown to the exercise, and felt, for the first time since arriving at the academy, a strange and unfamiliar calm settle over me. Not the calm of confidence, the calm of inevitability. Something was coming, whether I wanted it to or not, and no amount of careful restraint was going to stop it now. The training hall was packed by the time our group assembled the next morning, rows of cadets from every squad lining the observation deck above the main floor, eager to watch the joint exercise unfold. Officer Halden stood at the center of the arena, flanked by 2 other instructors, explaining the rules of the scenario in a calm, practiced voice. "This exercise simulates a contested extraction under time pressure," Halden announced, his voice carrying easily across the hall. "Pairs will alternate between offensive and defensive roles. Contact is permitted at controlled intensity, monitored continuously by the safety systems overhead. Anyone exceeding safe thresholds will be flagged and paused immediately." I stood near the edge of the arena floor, my uniform sleeves rolled to the elbow, my breathing steady despite the tight knot that had settled in my stomach since the pairing list went up. Across from me, Kalen Dorr rolled his shoulders with theatrical confidence, clearly enjoying the attention of the crowd above us. "Try to keep up, Deathworlder," he said, just loud enough for the front row of the observation deck to hear. A ripple of quiet laughter followed his words. I said nothing. I simply settled into the ready stance Halden had drilled into all of us during our very first week, weight balanced, hands loose, eyes steady. The first round began smoothly enough. I took the defensive role, and Kalen advanced with a series of textbook strikes, each one well within the boundaries the safety systems allowed. I redirected his momentum cleanly, using controlled, minimal movement exactly the way I had trained myself to, careful never to reveal more capability than the moment strictly required. The crowd above murmured with mild interest, clearly expecting little from a defensive exchange between 2 cadets whose skill levels, on paper, appeared roughly comparable. When the roles switched, and Kalen took the offensive position again for the second exchange, something in his posture changed. His earlier confidence sharpened into something harder, more deliberate. I recognized, a half-second too late, that he had been waiting for exactly this moment, in front of exactly this audience. "Let us see what the primitive world's finest can actually do," he said, and lunged forward with far more force than the drill required. What followed happened faster than I could fully process at the time, though I have replayed it countless times since in the quiet hours before sleep. His hand connected with the side of my face, an open strike delivered with enough force to snap my head sideways and send a sharp, ringing pain through my jaw. It was not an accident of momentum or a miscalculated training strike. It was deliberate, and it was meant to humiliate me in front of every cadet watching from above. For 1 full second, the entire hall went silent. I have spent my whole life explaining, patiently and carefully, that humans are not violent by nature. We are simply built from a world that demanded extreme capability just to survive an ordinary afternoon. Every reflex encoded into my body since childhood exists for exactly one purpose: to respond instantly and decisively to sudden, unexpected threat, without giving the threat time to repeat itself. My body did not consult me before it responded. It simply responded, the way 10,000 years of survival instinct trained it to. I do not remember consciously deciding to move. I remember the strike landing, and then I remember being already in motion, faster than the overhead safety systems appeared prepared to register. My arm swept upward, catching Kalen's wrist mid-retreat, and with a single precise motion of leverage, I redirected his own momentum back into himself. He was airborne for less than a second before his back struck the reinforced practice armor stacked at the edge of the arena, the impact loud enough to echo across the entire hall. The armor, designed to absorb far greater force during standard combat drills, cracked audibly along its center seam. Kalen slid to the floor in a heap, dazed but, I noted with some distant, disciplined part of my mind, entirely uninjured beyond the shock of the fall. I had redirected his own force, not added significant force of my own. Even in that instant, some deeply trained portion of myself had continued calculating exactly how much was necessary, and exactly where the line sat that I refused to cross. But the room did not see restraint. The room saw a Deathworld girl move faster than their instruments were calibrated to track, and send a noble-born cadet flying hard enough to crack reinforced armor plating without visible effort. For a long moment, absolute silence held the entire training hall. Then the overhead safety system finally caught up, its warning tone blaring across the arena, a full second too late to have mattered, flashing a bright amber alert that read exceeded threshold parameters, pausing all activity immediately. Officer Halden moved fast, crossing the arena floor in long strides, positioning himself between Kalen and me with the calm authority of someone who had clearly seen worse chaos in his career and refused to let a training hall descend into panic. "Stand down," he said firmly, though I was already standing perfectly still, my hands loose at my sides, my breathing only slightly elevated. "Cadet Voss, step back to the perimeter line." I obeyed immediately, walking back with slow, deliberate steps, aware of every eye in the hall following my movement. Kalen sat up slowly, rubbing the back of his head, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by something closer to genuine shock. He looked at me the way someone looks at a natural disaster they had, until this exact moment, believed only existed in stories told to frighten children. "She attacked me," he said, his voice unsteady, directed toward Halden rather than toward me. "You all saw it. She attacked me without warning." I saw a controlled defensive redirection following an unauthorized strike to Cadet Voss's face, Halden said flatly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The footage will confirm the sequence of events exactly as I observed them." The observation deck above us had gone almost entirely silent, cadets from a dozen species staring down at the arena floor with expressions ranging from disbelief to open unease. I caught sight of Nora near the front row, her hand pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with something that looked less like fear of me and more like fear for me. Halden turned toward me, his expression unreadable. "Cadet Voss, are you injured?" I touched my jaw gently, feeling the heat already spreading beneath my skin where Kalen's strike had landed. "A bruise, sir. Nothing requiring medical attention." "You will report to medical regardless," Halden said. "Standard procedure, following any threshold exceeding contact." "Yes, sir," I said quietly. The exercise was suspended immediately. Cadets ushered out of the training hall in small, murmuring groups, while medical staff arrived to check on Kalen, who insisted repeatedly, with mounting frustration, that the entire situation had been provoked without warning. I stood near the edge of the arena, waiting for instructions, watching the cracked practice armor being examined by two technicians whose expressions suggested they had not expected to find that particular kind of damage from a standard cadet exercise. One of the technicians ran a scanning device along the fracture line, then glanced up toward Halden with an expression of quiet disbelief. "This armor is rated to withstand direct impact from heavy combat drones," the technician said. "A cadet redirect should not have produced anything close to this kind of stress fracture." Halden did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed, the look of a practical man carefully recalculating everything he thought he understood about the cadet standing in front of him. "Cadet Voss," he said finally, "how much of that exchange would you say represented your full capability?" I considered the question carefully before answering, aware of how much weight my response now carried. "Less than a fraction of it, sir," I said honestly. I redirected his momentum. I did not add significant force of my own. If I had, the outcome would have been considerably different. A long silence followed my words, broken only by the quiet hum of the overhead lighting and the distant murmur of cadets still filing out through the exit corridors. "I see," Halden said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Report to medical, cadet. We will discuss the rest of this later." I left the arena floor with my composure fully intact on the outside, though inside, something had shifted permanently. For weeks, I had worked to hide exactly this outcome, terrified of confirming every quiet fear the Academy harbored about people from worlds like mine. Now, in a single unplanned exchange lasting less than 2 seconds, I had done exactly that, in front of an audience of witnesses and a recording system that would preserve every frame for review. I walked the long corridor toward the medical wing alone, my footsteps echoing softly against walls that suddenly felt far less welcoming than they had that morning. My jaw ached where Kalen's hand had struck it, though the pain was already fading, the way pain from Caldris always faded quickly once the immediate danger had passed. What lingered instead was something heavier, a slow, uneasy awareness that everything about my carefully maintained balance at this academy had just changed, whether I was ready for it or not. Behind me, in the emptied training hall, technicians continued examining the cracked armor plating, murmuring quietly among themselves, while somewhere in the administration wing, word of the incident was already beginning to spread through channels far faster than any official report could hope to control. I did not yet know it, but by the time I reached the medical wing, a full recording of the exchange had already been forwarded, through channels well above Officer Halden's authority, directly to the office of the Academy's Commandant. The quiet, careful life I had built for myself over the past several weeks was about to end, and something far larger, far more consequential, was only just beginning. By the following morning, the training hall incident had become the only topic anyone at the Academy seemed willing to discuss. I heard the whispers everywhere I went, in the dining hall, along the corridors, even drifting through the open doors of classrooms I passed on my way to review sessions. Cadets from a dozen worlds who had barely acknowledged my existence a week earlier now watched me with a mixture of caution and open curiosity, as though I had transformed overnight into something entirely different from the quiet, disciplined student they thought they knew. I was summoned to the Commandant's office shortly after midday, escorted by an aide who said almost nothing during the long walk through the administration wing. The Academy's Commandant, a composed, silver-haired officer named Halstrom Vane, had served for decades across multiple systems and carried a reputation for calm, measured judgment that even the most nervous cadets found reassuring. His office was quiet when I entered, the recorded footage from the training hall already displayed, paused, on a large screen along one wall. Commander Faith stood near the window, her expression far less dismissive than it had been during our earlier meeting. Officer Halden sat in a chair near the desk, his arms crossed, watching me carefully as I entered. "Cadet Voss," Vane said, gesturing toward an empty chair. "Please, sit." I sat, keeping my posture straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. "I have reviewed the footage from yesterday's exercise multiple times," Vane said, his voice calm and unhurried. "I have also reviewed your original complaint from 2 weeks ago, along with the informal notes attached to it." I said nothing, waiting. "I owe you an apology, Cadet," Vane said, and the words landed with a weight I had not expected. "Your initial report was not taken with the seriousness it deserved. That failure created the conditions for yesterday's incident, and that responsibility rests with this administration, not with you." I felt something loosen slightly in my chest, though I remained carefully still. "Thank you, sir." Vane gestured toward the paused footage on the screen. "I want to understand something clearly, Cadet, and I want an honest answer, not a diplomatic one. In that exchange, how much restraint were you exercising?" I considered the question carefully, aware that Officer Halden was watching me with the same quiet intensity from the day before. "A significant amount, sir," I said. My instinct in that moment was shaped by training that exists for one purpose: to end a threat as quickly and completely as possible. I redirected his momentum rather than adding force of my own, because some part of me continued calculating consequences even in that split second. "And if you had not calculated consequences," Vane asked quietly, "what would the outcome have looked like?" I hesitated, choosing my words with care. "Considerably more severe, sir. I do not say that to frighten anyone. I say it because I believe this academy needs an honest understanding of what it is actually training alongside, if it intends to keep accepting cadets from worlds like mine." A long silence followed my words. Commander Faith shifted near the window, her earlier composure visibly shaken. "We have never had a Deathworld cadet enrolled long-term before," Vane admitted finally. "The Academy has accepted candidates from difficult environments in the past, but nothing quite like Caldris. Our conduct protocols, our medical thresholds, our training safety systems, all of them were built around assumptions that simply do not apply to you." "I understand that, sir," I said. "I have tried, since arriving, to minimize how much that gap mattered. I see now that minimizing it only allowed the gap to grow more dangerous." Halden spoke for the first time since I had entered. "The armor cadet door struck was rated for direct combat drone impact. The technicians who examined it are still trying to understand how a controlled redirect produced that level of stress fracture. Because the redirect was not the full extent of what I was capable of in that moment," I said quietly. "It was the smallest fraction I believed I could manage while still neutralizing the immediate threat." Vane leaned back slightly in his chair, studying me with an expression that mixed genuine curiosity with something that looked, unmistakably, like unease. "May I ask you something directly, Cadet Voss? Not as your commandant, as someone trying to understand." "Of course, sir." "Since arriving at this academy," Vane said slowly, "how much of your actual capability have you been concealing, day to day, simply to avoid frightening the people around you?" I did not answer immediately. I thought about the corridor incident, the dismissed complaint, the careful restraint I had exercised in every drill, every sparring match, every casual interaction since stepping off the shuttle that first morning. I thought about my father's calm voice in that old recording, demonstrating how to break a predator's grip without raising his heart rate. "Most of it, sir," I said finally. "I came here hoping to be known for my discipline and my mind, not for what my body is capable of. I believed, perhaps naively, that if I simply worked hard enough and stayed careful enough, no one would ever need to find out." Vane exhaled slowly, exchanging a brief glance with Faith. "That is precisely the concern, Cadet. Not that you are dangerous, that an entire academy, built to train the galaxy's future officers, has been operating for weeks without any real understanding of what one of its own cadets is quietly holding back." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, covering ground I had not expected to discuss so openly on my first real meeting with the Commandant. I explained, as clearly and honestly as I could, what growing up on Caldris actually required, not as a boast, but as a plain accounting of survival. I described predator encounters that began and ended in seconds, environmental hazards that demanded instant reaction rather than careful thought, and a culture that had learned, out of necessity, to treat restraint as a skill every bit as important as strength itself. Faith listened with visible discomfort, occasionally glancing at her earlier notes from our first meeting, as though seeing them now through an entirely different lens. Halden asked several precise, practical questions about training safety thresholds, clearly already calculating how the Academy's systems would need to change. Vane, throughout most of the conversation, simply listened, his expression thoughtful and increasingly troubled. "I want to address Cadet Door's actions directly," Vane said finally, once my explanation had run its course. "The footage confirms an unprovoked strike, delivered deliberately and with clear intent to humiliate, following a documented pattern of prior harassment that this administration failed to properly address. That failure will be corrected. Cadet Voss and Cadet Dorr will face consequences appropriate to his conduct. Thank you, sir, I said quietly. I also want to be transparent with you about something else, Vane continued. News of yesterday's incident has already reached several other departments within this academy, along with a few visiting instructors from allied worlds. I imagine, by tomorrow, this conversation will no longer be a private matter between the four of us. He was right, though even he seemed to underestimate how quickly the story would spread. Within 2 days, the incident had reached instructors from 3 visiting delegations, several of whom, I later learned, came from worlds with their own long histories navigating challenging environments. One instructor in particular, a broad, quiet being named Instructor Doran, from a moderately harsh world called Threnholm, requested a private meeting with me shortly after the news broke academy-wide. I have read the incident report, Doran said, settling into the chair across from me in a small, quiet study room. I want you to know, Cadet Voss, that some of us are not surprised. Sir? I asked, uncertain what he meant. Threnholm is not Caldris, Doran said. Our world is difficult, but nowhere near as demanding as yours. Still, we understand something about what it means to come from a place that shapes its people through hardship, rather than comfort. I have spent years watching cadets from gentler worlds underestimate anyone who comes from somewhere harder. It rarely ends the way they expect. I did not want it to end this way at all, I admitted quietly. I wanted to be judged on my performance, not my biology. That is an understandable wish, Doran said, not unkindly. But sometimes, Cadet, an institution needs an uncomfortable lesson before it can properly recognize what it is actually working with. I suspect this academy just received exactly that lesson. Meanwhile, Kalen's family, upon learning of the incident, attempted almost immediately to reshape the narrative through their considerable influence. Official statements began circulating within academy channels describing the event as an unprovoked assault against their son, conveniently omitting any mention of the deliberate strike that had preceded my response. For a brief, tense period, it seemed possible that political pressure might succeed in rewriting the story entirely. The recorded footage, however, proved impossible to dispute. Every angle captured by the training hall's monitoring system showed the same sequence with unmistakable clarity: Kalen's deliberate strike, followed by my controlled, defensive redirection. No amount of political influence could argue convincingly against footage that clear, reviewed by dozens of instructors and officials across multiple departments. Faced with undeniable evidence, Kalen's family quietly withdrew their initial statements, though not without lodging a series of formal complaints regarding training safety protocols, clearly an attempt to shift attention away from their son's conduct. Vane, to his credit, did not allow the political pressure to alter his judgment. A formal review board was convened within the week, drawing together senior instructors, medical staff, and a small panel of visiting delegates, including Instructor Doran, to examine every aspect of the incident, and more broadly, to reconsider how the academy handled cadets from extreme environments. I sat through much of that review in a small observation room adjacent to the main hearing chamber, watching through a transparent partition as instructors debated training thresholds, safety protocols, and conduct guidelines that had clearly never anticipated a student quite like me. Kalen sat across the main chamber during his portion of the hearing, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by a stiff, uncomfortable posture that suggested he finally understood, perhaps for the first time in his privileged life, that consequences were about to arrive regardless of his family's influence. When the review board's preliminary findings were read aloud 2 days later, the words landed with a quiet, historic weight that seemed to settle over the entire academy. Cadet Kalen Dorr was found responsible for a deliberate, unprovoked assault, following a documented pattern of prior harassment that the administration had failed to properly address. His conduct would result in formal disciplinary action, a public record entry that would follow him through the remainder of his academy career, and a mandatory period of supervised training under Officer Halden's direct oversight. The academy itself, the board concluded, bore institutional responsibility for failing to recognize and appropriately respond to the initial complaint, a failure that had directly contributed to the escalation that followed. New protocols, they announced, would need to be developed immediately, protocols specifically designed to properly evaluate injury, contact, and training safety for cadets originating from extreme environment worlds. I listened to those findings from my seat in the observation room, feeling a strange, complicated mixture of relief and exhaustion settle over me. I had wanted, from the very beginning, simply to be treated fairly. It had taken a cracked piece of practice armor and a review board convened at the highest levels of the academy to finally make that happen. As the hearing adjourned and cadets began filing out of the main chamber, I caught Vane's eye through the transparent partition. He gave me a small, solemn nod, an acknowledgement that seemed to carry more weight than any formal statement the review board had produced. Something at this academy had changed permanently. That much was clear. What remained uncertain, at least to me in that quiet moment, was exactly what kind of place it would become now that its careful assumptions about gentleness and strength had been so thoroughly, unavoidably corrected. The changes began almost immediately, faster than I had expected from an institution as large and layered as this one. Within a week, new medical guidelines appeared across every department, revised specifically to account for physiological differences between species when assessing injury severity. A visible bruise on human skin, the updated protocols now noted clearly, could not be judged by the same scale used for species with different tissue density or healing patterns. What had once been dismissed as minor blunt contact would now trigger the same level of review as far more visible injuries among other species. Training safety systems throughout the academy underwent a complete recalibration as well. Officer Halden, working closely with a small team of engineers, spent nearly 2 weeks adjusting threshold sensors throughout the main hall, ensuring the systems could properly track and respond to movement speeds and impact forces that fell well outside their original calibration range. During one of our private training sessions, he mentioned, almost in passing, that the engineers had needed to rebuild nearly a third of the arena's monitoring software entirely from scratch. "We built this place assuming a fairly narrow range of physical capability," Halden admitted one afternoon, watching me complete a controlled drill with careful, measured movement. "Turns out that range was narrower than we realized. Conduct guidelines changed too, though those changes came with more visible discomfort among the senior staff. Commander Faith, in particular, seemed to carry a quiet weight of guilt in the weeks following the review board's findings. She approached me privately near the end of one training day, her earlier dismissiveness entirely gone. "I want to apologize properly, Cadet Voss," she said, her voice careful and sincere. "Not the formal apology already logged in your file. A personal one. I dismissed your complaint because I judged it against a scale that never should have applied to you. That was a failure of understanding on my part, and it placed you in real danger." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. I think many people here were operating from assumptions they never had reason to question before. I do not think that makes the failure less real, but I understand how it happened. "That is more grace than I probably deserve," Faith said quietly, before excusing herself. Kalen's formal punishment played out publicly over the following weeks, a mandatory period of supervised training under Officer Halden's direct oversight, combined with a public record entry that would follow him for the remainder of his academy career. His family's influence, which had shaped so much of his earlier confidence, proved unable to erase footage that every senior instructor at the academy had already reviewed personally. I saw him occasionally in the weeks that followed, always from a distance, always with a wide berth maintained between us that neither of us seemed inclined to close. His posture had changed noticeably, the easy, entitled confidence replaced by something more careful, more watchful. Other cadets, I noticed, had begun giving him a similarly wide berth, though for entirely different reasons than the ones he had once enjoyed. I did not seek him out during this period, nor did I feel any particular satisfaction in watching his reputation shift so completely. If anything, the entire experience left me with a strange, hollow kind of loneliness I had not expected. For the first time since arriving at the academy, people understood exactly what I was capable of, but that understanding had arrived through fear rather than respect, through a cracked piece of practice armor rather than through the careful discipline I had spent weeks trying to demonstrate. Nora remained one of the few constants throughout this entire period, checking in with me regularly, sitting beside me during meals without ever once treating me differently than she had before the incident. "You know," she said one evening, as we sat together in the study hall, "some of the other cadets have started asking me questions about you. Careful questions. Respectful ones, mostly." "What kind of questions?" I asked. "Whether it is true that your world has no safe seasons. Whether children where you come from really learn survival skills before they learn to read properly. Whether the stories about human reflexes are actually true, or just exaggeration that got out of hand somewhere along the way." I considered her words carefully. "What do you tell them?" "The truth," Nora said simply, "that you are one of the most disciplined, careful people I have ever met, and that whatever your world demanded of you clearly taught you more control than most of us will ever need to learn." Her answer settled something in me that had been unsettled since the training hall incident. I realized, sitting there, that the fear surrounding me had not spread uniformly through the academy. Alongside it, quietly and gradually, something closer to genuine respect had begun taking root as well, built not on the cracked armor plating everyone had witnessed, but on the restraint I had shown both before and after that moment. A month after the review board concluded its findings, the Academy held its first formal briefing on what administration officials were now calling Extreme Environment Integration Protocols. I was asked to attend, not as a subject under review, but as a contributing voice helping shape the policies that would govern how future cadets from worlds like mine would be trained, evaluated, and protected. Standing before a room of instructors, medical officers, and department heads, I spoke plainly about what I had experienced since arriving, careful to avoid exaggeration or self-pity, focusing instead on practical recommendations that might prevent another cadet from facing what I had faced. The core issue, I told the room, was never a lack of good intentions. It was a lack of understanding. This academy accepted a cadet from an extreme environment without fully considering what that meant for training safety, injury assessment, or conduct evaluation. I do not believe anyone acted with malice. I believe the systems simply were not built to recognize what they were looking at. Vane, seated near the front of the room, nodded slowly as I spoke, his expression thoughtful. "What would you recommend, Cadet Voss?" he asked, "for future cadets who might find themselves in a similar position?" I thought carefully before answering. Do not wait for a crisis to take a complaint seriously. Build systems that account for difference from the very beginning, rather than adjusting them only after something breaks. And perhaps most importantly, do not assume that restraint means an absence of capability. Some of the most dangerous people you will ever train are the ones working hardest to appear harmless. The briefing concluded with a series of formal recommendations that would, over the following months, reshape significant portions of the Academy's training curriculum, medical assessment guidelines, and conduct review procedures. I could not have imagined, on that first day I stumbled into the corridor wall after Kalen's shove, that the entire trajectory of my Academy experience would eventually lead to shaping policy for cadets who had not even applied yet. Late one evening, several weeks after the briefing, I found myself alone in the training hall after hours, running through a familiar drill sequence simply to clear my mind. The overhead lights had dimmed to their evening setting, casting long shadows across the arena floor, where, months earlier, cracked armor plating had briefly upended the entire Academy's understanding of what it meant to train alongside someone from my world. I heard footsteps approaching from the entrance, and turned, unsurprised somehow, to find Kalen standing at the edge of the arena, his posture stiff and uncertain in a way I had never seen from him before. "I did not expect to find you here," he said, his voice quieter than I remembered it being during our earlier encounters. I train here most evenings, I said simply. It is quiet after hours. He hesitated, clearly working up to something he had not fully rehearsed. I wanted to say something to you directly, not the formal apology I already gave through proper channels. Something honest. I waited, saying nothing, giving him space to find his words. I underestimated you completely, he said finally. Not just your skill, what you actually come from. I grew up somewhere that never asked very much of me, and I assumed that meant everyone else's world worked roughly the same way. I was wrong, and I put you in a position where you had every reason to hurt me far worse than you did. I redirected the smallest amount of force I believed would neutralize the situation. I said quietly, I did not want to hurt you at all. I wanted, more than anything, to never have to find out what would happen if I did not hold back. Kalen absorbed my words slowly, his earlier stiffness softening into something closer to genuine reflection. That restraint saved me from something considerably worse, did it not? Yes, I said simply, seeing no reason to soften the truth any further. He was quiet for a long moment, studying the faint outline of the repaired armor plating still visible along the arena wall, a permanent reminder of what had happened there. I have spent the past month training under Officer Halden's direct supervision. He has taught me things about discipline and restraint that I never once considered before this happened. I think, in some strange way, you did me a favor I did not deserve. I did not do it as a favor, I said honestly. I did it because it was the only thing I could control in that moment. I know, Kalen said. That is precisely why I respect it. He hesitated again, and then asked the question I had least expected from him. Would you be willing to teach me? Not the formal drills Halden already covers, the other things. The instincts your world taught you that mine never had to. I studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of the entitled confidence that had once defined every interaction between us. I found none. What remained instead was something closer to humility, hard-earned, and still unfamiliar to him. I will consider it, I said finally, not as a favor to you, and not because I owe you anything, but because I think an academy training future officers across a dozen worlds would benefit from cadets who understand each other honestly rather than through assumptions that eventually break under pressure. Kalen nodded, something like genuine gratitude crossing his face for the first time since I had met him. Thank you, Mira. It was the first time he had used my name. I turned back toward the arena, resuming my drill sequence as he quietly withdrew, leaving me alone once again in the dim evening light of the training hall. I moved through the familiar motions my parents had taught me years earlier, each movement precise and controlled, exactly the kind of discipline I had always hoped would define my time here, long before a single reckless shove in an empty corridor had set an entirely different chain of events into motion. The academy around me had changed permanently, its careful assumptions about strength and gentleness corrected in ways that would likely outlast every cadet currently walking its halls, myself included. I had come here hoping to be understood through my discipline alone, and instead, understanding had arrived through fear, through cracked armor, and through a review board that had needed undeniable evidence before finally taking me seriously. But somewhere within that difficult, unwanted lesson, something more lasting had also taken root, a quiet, growing respect, built not on what I was capable of, but on how carefully, consistently, I chose never to use it unless there was truly no other option left. I finished my drill as the overhead lights dimmed further toward the night cycle, my breathing steady, my mind calm, and for the first time since stepping off that shuttle months earlier, I felt something close to genuine belonging settle quietly over the empty training hall around me. Whatever came next at this academy, I would face it exactly as I always had, not as a Deathworld girl anyone needed to fear, but simply as Mira Voss, disciplined, careful, and finally, fully understood.